Well, hello again, Connecting Point Church, and we carry on in our series in the life of David and through 2 Samuel. And today we get to 2 Samuel chapter 19. We're starting in verse 9 through 43, and this is the text that covers David's return to Jerusalem after the brief civil dispute and that was caused by the rebellion of Absalom, and how David had to exile, and then he's been away, and now that Absalom has been defeated, and it leads to what happens next with the kingdom. And so what we find is David coming back, but there's some work to do for David. But before we get into the text today, I want to talk about a question, and that is, what have you learned from challenging relationships in relation to your walk of faith? Because in the stuff that we look at today, David faces challenges, particularly of how to establish loyalty and trust of those who opposed him. And what we see is David navigating some tricky relationships, some difficult circumstances. And we see a great display of wisdom and discernment, decisiveness, and grace. And so before we get into all that, what have you learned from challenging relationships in relation to your walk of faith? Okay, let's start here in verse 9 of chapter 19. Throughout the tribes of Israel, all the people were arguing among themselves, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country to escape from Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?" So what happens here is, with Absalom dead, the people of Israel, who had anointed Absalom as their king, the people of Israel began to debate their future, specifically as to whether David should be the king. They recalled that David had been the one that delivered them from their enemies, and particularly the Philistines, kind of their archenemy for a long time. And so what we have here in sort of a resigned way is that Israel accepts David back as their king. David should be their king. And there's really no discussion of an alternative. So they say, "Why do you say nothing about bringing him back?" It's like, well, what else are we going to do? But we also see in the text as we carry on that Israel's process is treated separately from Judah's. And this reflects the historic schism that existed, and that's basically between the 10 northern tribes of Israel and then Judah, and then as history would kind of play out, Benjamin would partner with Judah most of the time. And so we see this reflected in a lot of their history, and there's a list of scriptures here where we see this even when they're a united kingdom under Saul and David, and then we'll see it under Solomon. There is still sort of this schism that exists, and we see this reflected in 1 Samuel in chapters 11, 17, and 18, and we see it in 2 Samuel chapters 2, 3, 5, 11, and 12. And again, this is significant as it reveals the political fault lines that will lead to the division which really become evident at the end of this chapter that we're looking at today. So David gets accepted by Israel, but what about Judah? Let's pick it up in verse 11. King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. "Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood, so why should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of my army for life in place of Joab. He won over the hearts of the men of Judah so that they were all of one mind. They sent word to the king, return, you and all your men. Then the king returned and went as far as the Jordan, that would be the Jordan River. So upon hearing that Israel wanted him back as king, David then reached out to Judah. And he did this in a couple of steps. The first step was to send a message to the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, to first of all inform Judah that Israel had committed to David, and secondly to appeal to Judah on the basis that he was one of their own tribe. So why should they be the last to bring the king back? His second step, which is a very interesting step, was to offer Amasa, his nephew, and also a key figure in Absalom's regime, the position of commander of the army in place of Joab. The hope would have been to build connections with those who served under Absalom, as well as punish Joab for killing Absalom. As it turns out, David's strategy works. David won over the men of Judah, and they were united in their commitment to David. And so they then invited David to return to Judah. So we got the kind of the general politics out of the way. We have Israel, who basically sided with Absalom during the rebellion. They've invited David now to resume his role as king. And also now Judah. So they dealt with these separately. And so Judah now is inviting him back. But it seems like David had to work a little harder to get the invitation back from Judah. Okay, let's continue in verse 15. We're about halfway through it. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan where the king was, and they crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. So David, upon his return, he got as far as the Jordan River, where he was met by the men of Judah, as well as Shimei, along with 1,000 Benjamites and the house of Saul. So they're all there. As it turns out, the Shimei and the Benjamites seem to somehow get to the head of the pack, but we'll come to that. They came over the Jordan. They, meaning really the Benjamites that are mentioned here, they came over the Jordan for the purpose of serving the king's household. The victory and return of David likely caused some to be nervous about what it could all mean for them. And at the top of this list would be Shimei and the house of Saul, because of their history. So as we look, this chapter then gets into how David deals with Shimei, but let's review back to the episode that starts all this, and it's in 2 Samuel 16, 5-12. This is when David is leaving Jerusalem, and rather than staying to fight for the kingdom, he voluntarily leaves so that he wouldn't be in a fight with Absalom, but that wouldn't work. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei of Gera. And he cursed and came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, through all the troops, and the special guard were on David's right and left. And as he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you murderer, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hands of your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a murderer. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, my own flesh and blood is trying to kill me. How much more then this Benjamite? Leave him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. And it may be that the Lord will look upon my misery and restore to me his covenant blessing instead of his curse today. So that's the background text of what we're about to come to in chapter 19 now, and when David is returning. And it turns out that Shimei is the first one to address David. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, we're picking it up in verse 18, halfway through, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, may my lord not hold me guilty? Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind. For I, your servant, know that I have sinned, but today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king. So somehow Shimei makes it to the front of the pack and is the first one we see addressing David. Probably motivated by fear, for good reason, Shimei pleads for mercy. He claims to understand the error of his ways. And the evidence for this is him being the first to come and meet the king. So let's pick it up in verse 21 now. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed. David replied, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am the king over Israel? So the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king promised him on oath. So before David can even respond, Abishai, of course, one of David's generals, reminds David that Shimei cursed the Lord's anointed and should therefore be put to death. David really didn't dispute Abishai's assertion, but he did make it clear that this had nothing to do with him. And he also seems rather frustrated with the sons of Zeruiah. So right now, at this point in history, the sons of Zeruiah are Abishai and Joab. He then made an oath based on his authority as king that Shimei would not die. So I'd like to go to a table talk and discuss this question. David showed mercy to Shimei. Was this the right thing to do? And then, what is it like to receive mercy? And is it easy and natural to extend mercy? Take a few minutes and think that through. So David had to deal with Shimei a second time, and he showed mercy a second time to Shimei. The next in line to deal with David is Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson. So here we pick it up in verse 24. Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" And he said, "My lord the king, since I your servant am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled, and I will ride on it, so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God, so do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserved nothing but death from my lord the king. But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king?" And the king said to him, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land." And Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely." So we need a little bit of background to this, and you probably recall if you've been following through this series. David had made a promise to his best friend Jonathan, that he would take care of Jonathan's descendants, and that is who Mephibosheth is. He's the grandson of Saul, the son of Jonathan. And also Mephibosheth, because of an accident, he was crippled. And so David, in his fulfilling his promise to Jonathan, offered Mephibosheth a seat at the king's table, and what that means is he would take care of Mephibosheth, and he would live amongst in the king's palace. So anyway, we have more background to the story that happens here that involves Ziba, and you may remember this from chapter 16 in the first 4 verses. And what happened back then is, again, David is on his way out of Jerusalem, and this is where this happens. When David had gone a short distance from the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the wilderness." Then the king then asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" And here's the key event that took place here. Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks, 'Today the Israelites will restore to me my grandfather's kingdom.'" Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king." So, to summarize what happened here, Mephibosheth made the trek from Jerusalem to across the Jordan to see the king. And this would have taken considerable effort, taking into account that Mephibosheth was lame. He appeared as one who had been mourning. He was unshaven, unclean, didn't clean his clothes or anything. He appeared to be one who had been mourning for a long time, and that does turn out to be the case. And this surprises David, because David, back in chapter 16, had been deceived by Ziba. David was under the impression that Mephibosheth was anticipating that Israel would restore the kingdom to the house of Saul. However, when Mephibosheth approaches David, he is grateful, humble, not demanding anything, and he appears to be completely trusting of David. So when David is presented the account that Mephibosheth had been betrayed by Ziba, this puts David in a difficult position. You see, back in 16, David had taken all of Mephibosheth's land away from him and given it to Ziba because he thought that Mephibosheth was betraying him. So, and then he finds out Ziba has lied. So now you got this difficult situation that David needs to work through. On the one hand, Ziba had been a valuable service to David when he was fleeing Jerusalem. And on the other hand, Mephibosheth gave a credible account of events that severely compromised Ziba's position. So Ziba is this guy that did great favors for the king, has earned a favorable sort of, position with the king, at least how David saw him. But then he finds out that Ziba lied. So now his position is compromised. Previously, David had given Saul's lands to Ziba as a reward for his service, but also to serve as punishment to Mephibosheth for his disloyalty, only to find out that Mephibosheth had been loyal all along. And as a result, David decides to divide the land of the house of Saul equally between Ziba and Mephibosheth. So this allowed David to reward Ziba for his invaluable service and at the same time stay true to his promise that he'd made to Jonathan regarding his descendants. And that goes back to 1 Samuel 20, verse 42. In this case, David had to adjust his view of Mephibosheth because he had wrong information and had judged Mephibosheth based on that information. David also, obviously, had to forgive Ziba for trying to deceive him. And so then he decides to equally divide Saul's lands between Mephibosheth and Ziba, who is the head of Saul's household. We carry on in the story, and the next person that David needs to deal with, it's a little bit different. He's had to deal now with three of the Benjamites, Ziba and Shimei and Mephibosheth from the house of Saul, but also from the tribe of Benjamin. And now we come to somebody else, and this person wasn't even part of Israel, and it's Barzillai, the Gileadite, who also came down in verse 31 from Rogelim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way there. Now Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He had provided for the king during his stay in Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you." But Barzillai answered the king, "How many more years will I live that I should go to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of male and female singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to my lord the king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance, but why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return, that I may die in my own town near the tomb of my father and mother. But here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with my lord the king. Do for him whatever you wish." The king said, "Kimham shall cross over with me, and I will do for him whatever you wish, and anything you desire from me I will do for you." So the last person that David addresses before crossing was Barzillai the Gileadite, an old wealthy man who had provided for David during the exile when they were centered in Mahanaim. Barzillai had made about an 80-kilometer journey to witness the events of David's return. And so, in kind of an offer of hospitality and care in return for what Barzillai had provided for David, David offered to take Barzillai to Jerusalem and take care of him, but Barzillai preferred to return to his own land and to live out his days and then die among his ancestors. Barzillai suggested that Kimham, possibly a family member of Barzillai's, would go with David and live out his days provided for by King David, and David demonstrated gratitude, and he acted graciously to Barzillai. There is a reference in Jeremiah 41, verse 17, to a location near Bethlehem called Gareth Kimham, which means hospitality accorded to Kimham. So it appears that David followed through with this promise to take care of Kimham. So before we roll on to the end of our teaching today through this story, I want you to consider this. And David showed great gratitude to Barzillai, who cared for him and cared for his men while they were in exile. And just kind of a simple question, but an important question, that is, why is it so important that we show gratitude in our relationships? Okay, let's finish off, and we'll start here in verse 39. So all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and bid him farewell, and Barzillai returned to his home. When the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. Soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan, together with all his men?" All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, "We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves?" Then the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the king, so we have a greater claim on David than you have. Why then do you treat us with contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing back our king?" But the men of Judah pressed their claims even more forcefully than the men of Israel. And that's where this chapter ends. So after addressing the 3 Benjamites and the man who provided for him, all the people then David and his troops crossed the Jordan River to go to Jerusalem. The first thing that David encounters is what seems like a petty disagreement between Israel and Judah. Israel was jealous that Judah brought the king over the Jordan and claimed that they had more of a right to do this because they represented more people. There was 10 of their tribes and only 2 of the other tribes. Judah's position was that, well, we're closely related to David. I mean, David is from the tribe of Judah. But this is a foreshadowing event of future events. And it's just interesting that as things begin to come back together for David, and he's returning to Jerusalem to assume his position as king, and he does really well in addressing the house of Benjamin, or the tribe of Benjamin, the house of Saul, showing grace, to the one who was so generous with him and when he was in exile. And David is showing mercy, he's showing wisdom, he's doing all this, doing all the right things in his return to Jerusalem. Gets over the river, he encounters, the people of Israel, people of Judah, and what's the first thing that happens? Well, they start having a dispute amongst themselves. And this is a dispute, actually, that would just never go away. And so the chapter ends kind of negatively, and even though we've seen a lot of positive in David's actions. So I want you to kind of end with this. In this question, what role do challenges and disappointments have in developing our walk of obedient faith? See, even though David seemed to be doing everything right, it doesn't guarantee that everything would all go right. A lot went right in this chapter. But then we get to the end and it's like, what do we have here? A petty dispute. So what do we learn from these things? What happens in your life when you face challenges and disappointments? Even though you've been working hard, doing the right things, taking time to pray regularly, you're in the Word, you're doing well. And then you face something that you kind of go, well, why am I facing this? What role do those things have to play in your walk of obedient faith? Think about that, and then take some time to pray. And we'll pick up the story next week.